Hello and welcome back to our second video. In this video, we will focus on what is expected of you for the term paper. I'll give you some examples of what I think would make for interesting term paper phenomena to investigate and explain. These are just to be seen as examples, just to sort of light up your imagination. So after I go through about 3 of those, I will then summarize some good data sources that you may want to look into when it comes to finding your own macroeconomic problem or phenomenon that you will analyze in your own paper. Okay, so let's begin as follows. So I'm from Ireland, so I'm interested in the Irish economy. So I'm on the World Bank websites and I see that as I go through the data, that Ireland seems to have a pretty high net exports to GDP ratio. And in fact, it seems to be rising since at least the 1980s. We went from a country that imported more than it exported to one where since around, what was that, 1986, we're exporting more than we're importing. And it seems to be growing more and more over the years up until 33% in 2018. So the net exports minus imports in Ireland make up 33% of GDP. So that's very high. In fact, it's so high that I want to compare it to other countries, other economies. Germany is known for being a very strong exporting country. So perhaps we can compare it to Germany, if this loads. Or maybe the euro area. Let's see. Yeah, let's try the euro area. So we see for the euro area, well, as a whole, it's turned into a net exporter as well. But I mean, Ireland just blows it out of the water. And in fact, if you compare it to, let's say, the OECD countries, it's a similar story. Ireland is a strong net exporter, at least since the late 80s or so. Okay, so I want to investigate this further. So I go to the data bank of the World Bank. I get all the data they have for every economy on net exports. And I've already done this, I download it. And here we have the raw data. And we have numerous countries from 1960 to, well, 2018, I think it is. Here, yeah? And all I'm doing now is just taking the average of the last 10 years, or the average of the last roughly, well, 19 years, or since the 1990s, right? So that I just want to then rank these economies in terms of how high their net exports are as a percentage of GDP, right? So that's what I'm doing here. I've ranked them here using the average value from 2010 to 2018. In between, I found that, well, the World Bank has virtually every economy there is, except, well, there's a few countries for which there are no data. Interestingly, these are small financial centers in the Caribbean. We may come back to this a bit later. Okay, so I have my list, and I realize, well, actually, Ireland is up there, right? 21% as an average value since 2010. In fact, out of the economies that the World Bank has data for, which is virtually all of them, Ireland has the, what's that, 10th highest, no, 11th highest value of net exports over GDP. That's very high. But then I noticed something else. I realized that, well, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and all of them, these countries you see here are oil exporting countries. So I kind of know why these countries have a high net exports to GDP ratio. They are less interesting, if you like. So to compare Ireland to United Arab Emirates is less interesting for my purposes. So I find which countries are mainly oil exporting countries through more data that I find on the World Bank, which I can then also average and then find the top oil exporting countries and simply take them out of the analysis. And then, just because I'm just looking for an interesting phenomenon to try to understand, I say, okay, every country above 10% net exports to GDP ratio that is not an oil exporting country, or at least oil doesn't make up most of its, let's say, net exports. I want to understand them better. I want to see if there's any similarities. And here we are left with this rather strange list, perhaps on first glance. We've got Macau, the special administrative region of China, Luxembourg, Singapore, Ireland, Puerto Rico, Bermuda, Switzerland, and Malta. Okay, so this is already perhaps a basis on which you could write your paper. These economies share a number of things in common, and you could investigate what those things are and how this relates to the macroeconomic performance of these economies. Generally, what I'm referring to here is their status as tax havens. So why does being a tax haven mean you have high net exports to GDP ratio, or at least it's recorded as such? What's going on? So that could already make for an interesting paper. The oil exporting countries, not so interesting, right? Of course they have net exports to GDP ratio that are high, but why is Bermuda, Puerto Rico, Luxembourg, Malta, what's going on here? That could already be a paper, for example, where simply you begin with this observation and then you try to understand what is causing this and what the macroeconomic effects could be. Okay, relatedly, my second example, because this is the area of research that I find most interesting, has to do with corporate tax. In fact, this is based on a paper that I've written, which is going to be published in the coming months, about corporate tax competition. And here I have data for the OECD countries from, let me zoom in a little bit there for you, from 1981 till 2019. And this is the statutory corporate income tax rates. Yeah? Oh, as you can see here. Okay, let's go back there. I don't want to do that. So why am I interested in this? Well, here we have the OECD countries, their statutory corporate tax rate since 1981. Of course, we don't have data for all countries, especially former Soviet states, Eastern European states. But let's work with what we have. And we find that the average, which is here in the continuous dark line, has been falling over the period of analysis, from between 1981 and 2019. Okay. Is this being driven by just a couple of countries with extremely low corporate tax rates? Well, no, we can also see that the max and minimum corporate tax rates over this period have also shifted down. So there's this whole downward shift of the distribution of corporate tax rates between 1981 and 2019. Data from the IMF on the world average shows a similar thing. So that's already could be the basis of a paper. In fact, a similar exercise that was assigned to me in my master's program, albeit in Paris, basically was the premise for which I then much later wrote this paper. So you could look at this and ask yourself, well, why is this happening? Why is there this apparent race to the bottom? What are the macroeconomic effects of countries cutting their corporate tax rate en masse? That already is your way of opening the paper. Outlining the phenomenon, namely just by, using such a graph, describing the graph, and then explaining its significance and what you're going to be doing in terms of the question. Okay, lastly, further away from my research area is the topic of public debts, which is, of course, in the news a lot recently. So here I have data on public debt, again, as a percentage of GDP, for, virtually every economy around the world from the IMF. It goes back as far as 1800, but of course there's no data for most countries back that far, although some countries like the US and I think the UK do have data, or Sweden, for example. So now I'm just going to have a look at what countries have the highest debt to GDP ratio. Yeah. So over here, again, I'm just going to do a similar exercise where I take the average value. Of course, I could focus on 1 year, but perhaps if I look at 10 years or 20 years, it could be a bit more representative of what's going on in that economy rather than just a freak or unusual year. So here we have the average from the beginning of all time, perhaps not so perhaps not so telling or informative, since 1990, and here since 2008, since the last financial crisis for all the countries that the IMF have data on, which is virtually everyone. Now I've just got the averages and put them here instead, and I've ranked them by the average since 2008. We see that there's no data for Mongolia and Togo. That's a shame, but we must press on. And we find instead that Japan is top of the list. Since 2008, Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio. Perhaps you already knew Japan was a highly indebted country, government debt. Perhaps you did not. But perhaps you expected to find a country like Greece, which is in second place, to be at the top. But alas, there is Japan. Okay. So now the question could be, well, why does Japan have such a high debt to GDP ratio, public debt to GDP ratio? You could investigate this further, right? You could, in fact, compare Japan, which you can see here, to other G7 countries. Yeah, generally the countries considered the most economically powerful or influential, richest. And what we see is, well, it wasn't always this way, right? It's only since around the 70s that Japan has really shot up. So you could go into the causes of this high debt level and what are the consequences. Should the Japanese government care? So, with such a illustration, you could already kick off your paper. Okay, so those are just some examples that I found particularly interesting. Perhaps you do too, or perhaps you would like to investigate something altogether different, which you are, of course, welcome to do so. Whatever you do decide to investigate and whatever you do report on eventually, I would like you to use this essay template when it comes to the end of June or beginning of July when you're meant to present or submit to me your essay outline. Because your essay outline must be just one page, and you're welcome, in fact you should use this template here, which I've already uploaded to Moodle, where you just simply, in the first instance, you just put in a graph of the macroeconomic phenomenon that you are interested in. You should make it very clear what economy or economies you're interested in. Make it clear what's in the graph, essentially. For what years have you graphed your variable of interest? And make sure you note the sources that you use to find this data. Then a short description on why you think it's significant, why you think it perhaps presents a problem or might not be sustainable, and then simply state your research question, which should, of course, be related. A paragraph on how you are then addressing your research question is necessary. Of course, this is at the preliminary stage of writing your paper, so you may not have all the answers yet. And of course, you're not graded for this outline, but you should at least be able to tell me where you're going, in what direction you're going. So a brief, mention of what theory or literature you have read so far, which has kind of helped you organize your thoughts. And then, well, given the macroeconomic problem that you have identified, what policies at this early stage, beginning of June, beginning of July, what policies do you think should be implemented then in order to address this? For example, we'll come to an example shortly. And then in the bottom corner, a very brief sort of overview of what the structure of your paper will be. So some sort of preliminary table of contents. Of course, you begin with your introduction, end with your conclusion. But give me an idea of what I will see in between, and then perhaps some preliminary references. At least 5, between 3 and 5. Let's go with that. And try to fit it all on one sheet. You really don't have to go into too much detail In this box over here, you can make the font small or whatever to make it work. But so long as I know where you're going, then I'll be able to assist you in making sure you don't get lost along the way. Okay, lastly, we have, I thought I would provide you with what I would consider to be an essay outline, which could serve as an example for what I expect from you when it comes to the beginning of July when you submit your own essay outline. So here I've taken for the corporate tax rates example, simply because I've already written a paper on this, so I can provide an essay outline of what it might look like if I were in the class and submitting such a paper. Okay, so I basically just give the graph where I show this macroeconomic phenomenon. I state very clearly what's in the graph, what years it's applicable for, and I have the sources down here. I have a legend which is clear, yeah? Okay. A brief description of why it is significant. This is also going to be on Moodle, so you can take your own time to read it if you wish. So in particular, I'm arguing, well, corporate tax rates are important for the distribution of income. Distribution of income is important for demand and growth and unemployment and so on. So it's simple enough to make that connection. And then regarding how I'm addressing the research question, well, I plan to summarize the empirical literature, which talks about why there is this apparent race to the bottom, this downward trend, and how I intend to use a Kaleckian framework to understand the implications of this this downward race to the bottom. Don't worry if at this stage Kalecki and any particular term doesn't seem so comprehensible. This is just an example. You do not have to go into developing your own theory, developing your own model. You don't have to get too mathematical even, but as long as I know what references you're interested in, what you have been reading, what is framing your thoughts at least, this is what I'm looking for here. Yeah. Lastly, what economic policies do you think should be implemented? This is preliminary stage, of course, so, you know, there's no wrong answer. I just want to know which way you're going. So here, for example, I'm just saying, okay, it seems from what I've read so far that tax competition is not boosting investments as the government's intended or hoped, and it is making income distribution worse. So perhaps there is a role for some international forum or intergovernmental organization to combat tax competition. Okay. I have my table of contents in the corner, and I have a few references which just give the lecture an idea of what you have been looking at. All right, so let's see how long have I been speaking already? So that should do it for now. I do have some data sources which I will upload to Moodle. Maybe some of you are familiar with these already. It's not worth going through on video exactly what they're all doing. I'll just rather upload the PowerPoint presentation so you can do that in your own time. The ones that I put first generally are more useful than the ones that come last, or are more of general use than of specific use. But if you do have any questions about data sources, do ask me, do let me know. In particular, I mean, I particularly like Amico, really good for the EU countries and other major economies. The World Bank is great, it's a very nice user interface to use. OECD is also quite good. I mean, they all have their strengths and weaknesses. So for whatever purpose it may be, depending on what country you're interested in, you will almost certainly find something in here for your purposes. Okay, so that's it for now. Like I said, at least in principle, you could start working on your paper already in week 1. You could already start looking for a macroeconomic phenomenon. As you do so, email me. You do not have to wait for the essay outline to get in touch and say, I think this might be a good idea. This looks interesting. So perhaps just have a little, send off a little email if you think you found something. Just, keep it short. And I'll then be able to say, yeah, whether it's perhaps a useful avenue of research. Okay, that's it for now. Do get in touch if you have any questions or if anything was unclear. We will, of course, speak about everything on Thursday. All right, bye for now. Take care.